It started with laughter, low at first, then swelling into a wave of amused disbelief. A popular national panel show had just played a clip from a Senate hearing. The camera lingered on Senator John Neely Kennedy, who, in his unmistakable Louisiana drawl, asked a high-ranking official, "Do you know the difference between a loophole and a black hole, sir?" "'Cause one swallows laws and the other swallows galaxies." The panelists erupted. One pretended to fan themselves, another mockingly mimicked his voice. "Bless his heart, y'all," one said, giggling. "Is this man serious?" They portrayed him as a walking caricature, out of touch, unrefined, an echo of a past America. Their voices dripped with irony. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful political twists and real stories that defy expectations. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The clip circulated rapidly across social media. Reactions were split. Many joined the panel in ridiculing the senator's style, calling it embarrassingly Southern. Others defended him, citing his reputation for clever interrogations and witty remarks. But none of that mattered to the panel. Kennedy was the joke of the hour. What most didn't realize, or simply ignored, was that behind the cadence of Kennedy's voice lay an intellect honed in some of the most prestigious institutions in the world. Born in Mississippi and raised in Louisiana, John Neely Kennedy had graduated magna cum laude from Vanderbilt, earned a law degree from the University of Virginia, and completed his education at Oxford University in England. But he never traded in his accent or his values. Those who knew him closely described him as razor-sharp, unflinchingly prepared, and deeply principled. In courtrooms and committees, his unassuming appearance often gave him the advantage. People underestimated him until he spoke. Yet in this moment, Kennedy remained silent. While Twitter burned and pundits piled on, he offered no retort. No statement, no post, no deflection, just silence. Inside the control room of the panel show, the atmosphere was triumphant. The segment had gone viral. Viewers were tuning in. Producers gave the green light to run a follow-up live segment the next day, capitalizing on the momentum. The hosts were ready, their jokes sharpened. When the time came, the panel reconvened. "Are y'all ready for round two?" the anchor teased, smiling into the camera. They played another clip, this time of Kennedy questioning a tech executive. "So let me ask you, sir, if a data breach leaks like a sieve, is that a feature or a bug?" Again, laughter, more mocking. The show was in full swing halfway through its segment when the producer received an unexpected note through his earpiece. "There's a caller on the line, says he's Professor Stanley Wexler. Harvard Law School, wants to comment on the segment." The name landed with a thud. Wexler wasn't just a professor, he was a legend in legal circles. Author of definitive constitutional law texts, former advisor to Supreme Court justices. His opinion wasn't just respected, it shaped discourse. The host hesitated. Did he say what it was about? He said, "He taught Senator Kennedy." There was a beat of silence. Then the host straightened in his chair, trying to mask his surprise. "Well," he said, signaling the producer, "let's take the call." The air thickened with curiosity. The audience, both in the studio and at home, leaned in. No one knew it yet, but the story had just shifted. The line connected, and for a heartbeat no one spoke. Then a deep, steady voice came through. "This is Professor Stanley Wexler. I taught constitutional law at Harvard for 42 years. Senator John Kennedy was one of my students. I believe you owe him more than a laugh." The room fell into an uneasy hush. The hosts exchanged glances, unsure whether to cut the call or let it unfold. But Wexler's voice held a kind of gravity that made interruption unthinkable. "I watched your segment yesterday," he continued. "It saddened me, not because you mocked a man I once taught, but because you dismissed someone you clearly don't understand. That's dangerous and lazy." One of the panelists, a political analyst known for his sarcasm, chuckled awkwardly. "Professor, I'm sure Senator Kennedy is a bright man, but come on, he sounds like he walked out of To Kill a Mockingbird." Wexler didn't miss a beat. "And Atticus Finch remains one of the most principled characters in American literature. Perhaps you should read it again." That silenced the panel. Wexler went on, his tone calm but firm. "John Kennedy was not just bright, He was brilliant. I remember a debate in my third-year seminar. The topic was executive power during wartime. John stood alone against a room full of students arguing for expansive presidential authority. He dismantled their positions, point by point, with logic so precise that one of the guest judges asked me afterward if he was already practicing law. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I've taught thousands. Very few ever made me question my own assumptions. John did, frequently. The host tried to steer the conversation. But, Professor, don't you think public figures should be open to critique, especially if their communication style is confusing or, let's say, eccentric? Critique, Wexler replied. Critique is fine. Mockery rooted in ignorance is not. You're confusing style with substance. Because he chooses to speak plainly, because he refuses to dress his sentences in elitist jargon, you assume he has nothing to say. That tells me more about your bias than his intellect. Social media, already abuzz from Wexler's unexpected call-in, exploded. Comments flooded the show's live stream. He just dropped the mic. Wexler is not playing. Is this the moment the panel realizes they messed up? Back on the air, one of the younger panelists tried to salvage the moment with a question. Do you have any specific examples, Professor, of Kennedy's brilliance in action? Wexler smiled audibly. I do. We held a mock trial in class, Harvard's internal competition. John volunteered to defend a fictional defendant in a case involving digital surveillance and Fourth Amendment rights. 3 of our most experienced mock prosecutors lined up against him. He tore through their arguments, not theatrically, methodically. He cited precedent they missed. He reframed their evidence. One of them tried to trap him in a contradiction, and he corrected her. Not with attitude, but with a quote from a real Supreme Court opinion she'd misread. Another pause. He won the case, and the respect of every person in that room. Silence settled over the panel. The bravado had drained from the discussion. For the first time in 2 days, they weren't laughing. The host finally cleared his throat. Professor Wexler, we appreciate you calling in, truly. You're welcome, he replied. Next time you sit behind those microphones, remember, intelligence doesn't always wear the accent you expect. Then the line went dead. No music, no transition, just a silence that said everything. The clip of Professor Wexler's call spread like wildfire. By midnight, it had over 10 million views across platforms. Political commentators scrambled to revise their talking points. Suddenly, it wasn't just about Kennedy. It was about who gets to define intelligence in America. News headlines shifted tone. Words like misjudged, underestimated, and unfairly mocked appeared beside the senator's name. But John Kennedy, as always, remained silent. He hadn't tweeted. He hadn't released a statement. He hadn't smiled smugly at the attention. For all the world knew, he hadn't even seen the clip, until a week later. On a modest Baton Rouge radio station, Kennedy joined a morning program hosted by longtime local journalist Melinda Crane. She introduced him gently, avoiding the viral controversy, but Kennedy didn't flinch. I heard about it, he said, his voice as calm and steady as ever. Didn't watch it, though. Don't really have time for TV that thinks mocking folks is the same thing as journalism. Melinda hesitated. Professor Wexler defended you pretty strongly. I heard about that too. He's a good man. Taught me more about justice than most ever will. But I don't need defending. I am who I am. I say things plainly, because I believe politics should be plain spoken. I'd rather be clear than clever. The phone lines lit up. Listeners called in, not with outrage, but with gratitude. A retired teacher said, "You remind me of my father. He was a welder, but he could outthink anyone I knew." Another said, "You proved we don't have to sound like Harvard to be worth listening to." National media picked up on the interview. Unlike his detractors, Kennedy didn't gloat. He didn't attack the panel or even name them. He simply moved forward. And something began to shift. In Kansas, a state senator tweeted, "Maybe I judged Kennedy too fast. I listened to that interview. Guy knows his stuff." In Oregon, a political podcast released a full episode titled The Kennedy Miscalculation. In Georgia, A high school civics teacher assigned the Wexler call and Kennedy's radio segment as part of a lesson on implicit bias. The national conversation had moved beyond Kennedy himself. People were asking broader questions. Why do we equate accents with intellect? Why do we assume polished speech equals depth? And why were so many so quick to laugh? On college campuses, debates flared. Some students argued that mocking public figures is fair game. Others countered that there's a difference between critique and condescension. In a law school forum in New York, a young professor asked her students, "Would you have dismissed him too?" The moment wasn't a scandal, it was a mirror. And as public interest grew, major networks began to reach out to Kennedy's office. They wanted him on air. They wanted to set the record straight. For days, he declined. But one morning, a major outlet made an offer through a trusted journalist. No edits, no ambush, just a live conversation. Kennedy thought for a long time before replying. "All right," he said at last, "but I'm not going there to settle scores. I'm going there to talk about something bigger than me." And just like that, the story took another turn. The senator, who had once been laughed at, was about to step into the national spotlight again, not as a punchline, but as a man with something to say. The invitation was confirmed. Senator John Kennedy would appear live on national television. No pre-taped segment, no filtered sound bites. Just an open conversation. When the morning came, the nation watched. Kennedy sat across from a seasoned anchor, someone known more for hard questions than soft smiles. Yet from the moment he spoke, the tone shifted. "I grew up in Zachary, Louisiana," he began. "Small town. Folks there didn't have much, but they had each other. My dad ran a small bank. My mama taught Latin. Every Sunday she made me translate Cicero before I could eat lunch. That's how I learned to argue. With respect, not volume." The anchor smiled faintly. Kennedy continued, "I speak the way I was raised to. That doesn't make me less intelligent. It makes me honest. And let me tell you, there's a difference between clever and wise. One tries to win arguments. The other tries to understand people." The questions came, pointed but fair. Kennedy answered each with clarity. On education, he spoke about access. On law, about balance. He referenced case law, economic theory, personal experience. The accent never changed, but the perception did. He didn't take a single shot at the panel that had mocked him. "I've been in public life a long time," he said. "You learn quick. Don't take it personal and don't make it personal. When folks misunderstand you, that's their burden. But if you carry it around, it becomes yours too." The camera cut briefly to the anchor, visibly moved. Later in the interview, the discussion turned more philosophical. "What do you think this whole incident says about America right now?" the anchor asked. Kennedy paused. Then, "It says we're quick to judge and slow to listen. We're trained to associate a certain look, a certain tone with truth. That's a dangerous way to live. It shuts people out, and it shrinks the room where ideas can live." He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but deliberate. "I've sat in rooms with people who had 3 Ivy League degrees and no moral compass. And I've learned life lessons from folks who never made it past high school. Wisdom doesn't follow a zip code." The final portion of the interview opened to audience questions. A young woman stood up, college-aged, clear-eyed, nervous. "Senator," she said, "I'm about to graduate. I don't fit the mold either. I've been told I sound too rural, too simple. How do you stay true to yourself when it feels like everyone wants you to be something else?" Kennedy looked at her for a long moment. "Don't trade your roots for someone else's approval," he said. "There's power in knowing who you are. If you try to sound like everyone else, you'll forget how to speak your own truth. And that's the only one worth telling." The crowd fell silent, then erupted in applause. After the show, that single exchange went viral again. But this time there was no laughter, just a collective stillness. People weren't amused. They were listening. Kennedy had done more than defend himself. He had reframed the narrative. Without bitterness, without bravado, he had reminded the country that intellect has many voices, and not all of them sound polished. What began as a takedown had become something else entirely. And for once, Everyone seemed ready to hear what came next. 2 weeks later, the same panel that had once mocked Senator John Kennedy returned to the air, more measured, noticeably subdued. The anchor opened the segment with an unfamiliar tone. We want to begin today with a moment of reflection. Recently, we aired commentary about Senator John Kennedy that, in hindsight, was dismissive and unfair. Since then, we've listened and learned. One by one, the panelists echoed the sentiment. Some offered apologies. Others admitted their bias had clouded their judgment. One said, "I mistook style for substance. I won't do that again." There were no excuses, no qualifications, just acknowledgement. Kennedy didn't respond publicly. He didn't need to. Instead, he kept doing what he'd always done, showing up, asking questions and speaking plainly. On Capitol Hill, he walked the steps with the same calm gait. Reporters approached him more carefully now. His interviews were more frequent, but not louder. He hadn't changed, but the perception of him had. Across the country, people kept talking. In classrooms, professors used the story to teach about stereotyping and humility. On podcasts, hosts discussed the difference between being underestimated and being undervalued. It became shorthand for something bigger. Then, without fanfare, an op-ed appeared in The Atlantic. The byline read, "Stanley Wexler," the title, "The Mind Behind the Accent." In it, the professor wrote not just about Kennedy, but about America. We are a nation that celebrates freedom of thought, yet we so often shun the forms that thought can take. We prefer the familiar cadence of our own echo chambers. But wisdom doesn't always sound the way we expect. Sometimes it comes dressed in twang and metaphor, and when it does, we must be wise enough to hear it. The piece went viral. Bookstores began stocking it as a pocket-sized essay collection. It was taught in freshman seminars, quoted in commencement speeches, but Kennedy never promoted it. When asked, he said only, "Professor Wexler always did have a way with words." Weeks passed. In a small post office in Montana, a package arrived for Senator Kennedy. Inside was a letter, written in neat cursive by a 16-year-old named Clara Jensen. "Dear Senator Kennedy," it read, "I've been told that to be taken seriously, I need to lose my accent, my boots, and sometimes even my values. But after watching you, I realized I don't need to change to be heard. I just need to know what I stand for. Thank you for teaching me that." Kennedy kept the letter in his desk drawer. He never mentioned it on the floor, never shared it on social media, but those close to him said he'd take it out every so often, read it slowly, then fold it back with care. What had started as mockery ended in movement. A conversation that began with laughter had transformed into reflection. And Senator John Neely Kennedy, with his Oxford mind and Louisiana tongue, had reminded America of a simple, timeless truth. Real strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just speaks and trusts the world will catch up. Before we close, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more untold stories that challenge the way we think, feel, and see the world. And if you want to keep this journey going, click the video on your screen now. You won't want to miss what comes next.